Hey, welcome to the Reach podcast, and we are excited that you've joined us. We got some guests, we'll introduce them in just a second, but want to have a content warning, a gentle warning that this is a unique podcast on the list of podcasts, and so we're going to be covering the content of Genesis 34, which includes rape and sexual violence and lots of other deception and even murder and sort of a ravaging of a whole city. It's not light content. That will only be the beginning of our podcast together, talking about the text, and then we're going to zoom it out and talk about the reality of this in our lives, in our communities, in our families. And so just be warned, but be welcome as well. And so with that said, I want to pray. I want to introduce our panel, and then we'll get started, okay? Father, we bless you. We thank you for the gift of your word, again, which does not sweep sin under the rug, is not edited out of ugly and awful parts of reality of the story of the patriarchs and the apostles and the prophets, but you include really hard moments, dark moments, to show your grace in those moments and to show you care, but also to speak to the realities of life in outside of Eden. And so we thank you for that. We ask for your blessing on us as we speak about it and on everyone who listens, that you would care gently for their souls, that you would use this time to heal and to reconcile and to shine light into places that are still dark, and to do that more and more. So we thank you for this time. We thank you for your word. We thank you for your spirit in us, and we pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. 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 Could you give us a brief introduction? We'll start with you, Erin. You want to introduce yourself?
I'm Erin Sanchez. I am one of the pastors at Reach, and my background that helps kind of in this context is I'm clinically trained as a therapist, and my specialty when I was working as a therapist was women's trauma and processing hard events like this. So I think I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you for being here.
That is me. Yeah.
Amy?
Yeah. My name is Amy Lathrop, and like Erin, I'm a clinically trained therapist as well, specializing in trauma, and I manage the Reach Counseling Center along with Josh Loy.
Yeah.
Amazing. Tell me about your family, Amy.
Yes, I have two children. We live in Seattle. My son is 27. My daughter is 26.
Awesome.
And yeah.
In Seattle proper? Okay.
Actually, my son lives in Tacoma.
Okay.
And my daughter's in North Seattle.
Oh, wait. So you drove a bit to be with us. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you for being here.
Great. I'm Josh. You guys know me. I'm a pastor here. I'm also a licensed therapist. I'm realizing, Scott, you're the only not licensed therapist in the room.
That's on purpose.
Today.
This is I'm not embarrassed by that, nor am I going to try to pretend to be you.
I was like, wow, that's interesting.
Yeah.
I'm a counselor. I'm a dad. I run a group practice, and then I also help out at the Reach Counseling Center.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, my name's Scott Pollok. I'm not a licensed therapist. I've been a pastor in ministry for almost 30 years. And so I have been in counseling situations as a pastor. And I learned, not at the beginning, but I learned as quickly as I could to say, I'm not a therapist. I'm not pretending to be a counselor. I have very, very little counseling training, formal training, which we did in seminary, but I have some experience, and I have way more experience in counseling myself. And so I'm actually quite a fan of counseling and therapy, and send as many people as I think can and listen to me to do that. And so I've had several counselors over the years, and an ongoing relationship with a pastor. He's a medical doctor, a psychiatrist, and counselor, biblical counselor, a Christian counselor, we say. And he's taught me so much about myself and Jesus and just my heart and soul and story. And so I'm grateful for the gift of counseling. So yes, I'm the odd man out. I will very much serve as just the moderator of this, speak a little bit to the biblical character of the chapter, but that's it.
Yeah.
So,
well, there's so much overlap between those two.
Say again?
There's so much overlap between those two.
Between what two?
Between pastors and counselors.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
I hope so. I want more and more. I want more and more. I don't, my fear is, and I say earlier on, my only fear, I would say not fear, my only hesitation is that I think pastors are often expected to be counselors, expected to be as wise and trained formally as you are. And I know I felt that pressure early on. I felt like I had to know the answer to every situation. And when a couple or a person is sitting in front of me and they're sharing the enigma of their story, I felt very burdened to be able to decode it all and work it all out. And I had to wrestle with that. And so absolutely, I hope that the counseling field and expertise and the great sanctity and sort of holiness of those moments pastors are aware of and not embarrassed of, that we don't have this negative view of counseling and therapy, but also that pastors know they don't have to be all that counselors are. So yeah, thanks. I hope we overlap that a lot.
Yeah.
I'm already talking a lot and too much.
No.
So this is part of our Genesis study on Sundays at Reach that we started in early 2024, and looks like we will end in early 2025, somewhere around that. And so we scheduled to take a full year on that. The only chapter that we decided to, a little bit of a backstory, the only chapter that we decided to not preach through on a Sunday morning is chapter 34. And we did that with great thoughtfulness to it. It was not a fear-based decision. We talked about it months and months out and said, I think this might be a chapter that is difficult. Of course it's difficult, but it might be a chapter that's best done in a longer format, in a panel format, rather than just a single speaker or even two speakers speaking to it, with the time limit and the audience, the diverse audience on a Sunday morning. And so passed that by some of the pastors and elders, and they thought it was a great idea. And so that led us here. That's why we're here. And if you're tuning in, listening to this, I would encourage you now, because we won't read the whole chapter, I'd encourage you now to just hit pause and go over to your Bible app or open your Bible and read or listen to Genesis chapter 34. We will not be reading the whole chapter during our time together, but it will greatly help you to read that, and you'll know perhaps why we are doing this in this format. And so, so you can pause now and do that. The recap of the story is within the life of Jacob. We are headed to the end of Genesis already. And the biblical kind of recap of it all is not simple. I'm not meaning to overlook anything. That's why we're just going to do this up front, and then we'll get into the wider applications of all of this. But this involves the only named daughter of Jacob. There is a text later that says his daughters, and so many people, including me, believe that he had many more daughters. Those probably also include his daughters-in-law, the ones that are married to his sons, but I think he also had many daughters. Dinah's the only one ever mentioned because of this chapter. We want to know her because of this chapter. And Dinah is raped in this chapter by a man named Shechem, which he is a Hivite, the son of Hamor the Hivite. So these are Canaanite men outside of the nation of Israel, outside of the covenants of the nation of Israel, outside of the family. And this gets really bad. She is raped. There's this impulsive, lustful act by Shechem, which the city is probably named after him. And Jacob hears about it. He doesn't tell his sons because they're out with the flock. When he comes back, they're very, very angry. And they enact revenge, and they want to enact revenge. Shechem wants to do the right thing after the rape, comes and asks Jacob and asks his sons, and they set up essentially a plot. and they say, "You're not us. You're not circumcised. So you circumcise all the men of your city, then we will let you have our sister, our daughter, as a wife." So they do that, and while they are in pain from an adult circumcision. I think babies circumcised is great pain too, but an adult later in life circumcision, the sons, particularly Simeon and Levi, come in and they slaughter the city, and that is essentially how the story ends. So it is difficult in and of itself. The larger purpose of the story in the end of Genesis is to serve as the reason why. Now we're looking at Genesis 49 now, to serve as the reason why Jacob does not view Levi and Simeon. Simeon's number 2, Levi's number 3, the daughters of Leah, the sons of Leah. Why he does not view them as the rightful heir, the ones to take on the family legacy and name. And so Reuben is disqualified. Reuben's number 1. Reuben is disqualified because he sleeps with his father's concubine. All of these are mentioned in 49. And then Simeon, number 2, and Levi, number 3, are disqualified because of the vengeance and blood of this act in this chapter. And then Judah, even though he has something we talked about later in church in chapter 38, he is not the shining light either. For some reason, because of God's grace, he is chosen as the one who will carry on the name. And so we're looking at the family of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and then we're focused on Judah by the end of the book of Genesis. So in the book, chapter 34 is a real story. It serves probably in the timeline, in the order of the chapters, it seems. Most scholars agree. The larger story is a story of disqualification of 2 sons. And this is the reason why we thought it would be better to do this in a podcast, because to just talk about the disqualification of the 2 sons in the book of Genesis is not good enough. I mean, it's the point of the larger narrative, but it doesn't cover the reality of rape and sexual violence in the lives of people. Not to mention murder and vengeance and revenge, which we probably won't talk about very much. But that's the larger purpose in the book. That's about all there need to be said about that. So read chapter 34, and then read Jacob's blessing at the end of his life in chapter 49, and you'll make the connections, and that's important. But we wanted to now expand out and say, as you guys, first big question is, as you guys have read this story recently, we were talking before we started to record, and how heavy it was for us all to reread this story recently. What else did you see in the story? How did it impact you? Because it is heavy. It is hard.
Yeah, I think one of the things that just kept coming to mind, which I think probably most people would come to their mind, is just the stomach drop of the whole thing, of just like feeling what maybe some people might feel what Dinah was feeling, even though it's actually not explicitly said what she feels at
Correct.
all.
Yeah. That's the hard part of the story,
Yeah.
is we don't really focus on Dinah very much. We focus more on the brothers.
Yeah.
And whereas I feel like we should focus more on Dinah. I want to hear more from Dinah. I want to focus in on, but again, because the Genesis is concerned with the narrative of Jacob and the family, we tend to look more at the brothers, which again is like a second stomach drop. I'm like, I want to hear more about her.
Yeah. But I also think that as I was reading through it, I was just noticing these little details where I was like, oh, this is the like step out. Oh, this is the step out. And by that, I guess I mean that God hates injustices and he is hurt by these things. But when the brothers step out and do it themselves, or when, all of these ways that as we're reading the story, we see people kind of, but then he tried to maybe make it right. And then this person said this, or this went this way. And just how messy things get when we are living like these real stories of, there's no black and white really in this story of like, this was wrong. And then this
Correct.
was the justice that was brought here. It was like, there's so many different pieces to it that I'm sure we'll get to. But yeah, I think I throughout the story, I was left feeling like, oh, yeah, what was Dinah feeling? Oh, when they brought her out of Shechem's house after they slaughtered everybody, why was she there, actually? Were they married? They weren't married
all
yet.
these
Why was she
questions,
there?
yeah.
Like, what was she
Technically they were,
feeling?
right?
Yeah, like,
The rape.
right,
Yeah.
right. Was she being treated as a wife in the home? Like, just all of these questions of things that aren't necessarily talked about in the story.
Yeah, so many questions. We go through Genesis, so many questions,
Yeah.
fewer answers, right?
Yeah. But I think
Yeah.
the
Oh,
last
sorry.
thing,
No,
the
of
one
course.
last thing that I will say is I think that all of the questions that come up caused me really to think about like the real lived stories of people in our modern time. People that I know, people that, like my own story, where there's 1,000 questions that come up. And I think in this, as all of those questions were coming up, I was like, oh, this is actually what it feels like often to be like, why this, why that, why this, why that, when you're working through a story like this with someone sitting across from you in a therapy room or a friend or your own story or those kinds of things. So anyway, those were the thoughts that I had. But yeah.
Yeah, I think when I read it through a few times and I started to feel kind of activated and I was like, oh, what is this about? And I think it was she had no voice. And then she became a pawn for her brothers. So
Excellent, yeah.
what actually happened in the story, the rape was this deeply devastating thing, the very personal thing that happened to this woman. But then she gets pushed to the side as, the rest of the drama, I'll say, ensues with the brothers wreaking their vengeance. And
Pawn is a
so-
great word.
Yeah,
It's exactly what she is.
to the fact that they send her back into the home of her attacker.
Yeah.
There's a lack of protection. She's not a favored child.
Because she's a woman in that
Is-
culture,
yeah.
probably, right?
And not just a woman. I think if you are a favored woman, there are protections.
Okay.
You don't go anywhere by yourself.
True.
Those sorts of things. And so, yeah. And the idea that, or this story doesn't really show any care or concern or how do we care for somebody in the aftermath of what happened. Yeah. And then I really found Shechem's lust turn to love. I love her. I think that's really such a part of so many sexual abuse stories, so many people's sexual abuse stories, is this the love that the perpetrator has for the victim. So I think that also really
Wow.
felt
I
heavy.
want to come back to that. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
just hard.
For our listeners and for me, I think I understand, but you said you were very activated by that. It just defined the idea of being activated and what that means.
Yeah. Good question. Yeah, I think it's going to be different for everyone, but
course.
for me personally, it was this feeling of anger and disgust and outrage.
So as you read it, these emotions are surprising you.
Yeah.
Or maybe not surprising you.
Well,
Yeah.
I don't know if they surprised me. Maybe it was surprising because I have read this story before.
Sure.
But I think the more I work with women who have sexual trauma and the long route to healing, and working with, and we'll probably get into this later, but sexual violation really creates such a split from the self, from the sense of self, from feeling safe in your body, from even knowing who you are, from your ability to trust yourself and then other people. And so I see in her story all this complexity of what that violation probably, I'll just say, did to her, and then not addressing it at all, as if it was just this event that happened. And yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Josh, any thoughts on
I
just the
I
story?
love that we're talking about it because I think what we're even describing, Diane Langberg teaches on this passage. And I really like
Say
her.
the name
Diane
again.
Langberg. She's written
Okay.
a couple books on trauma and abuse. But she says that this passage and the way we've not taught it even mirrors replicates the forgetting of the woman
Yeah.
who has been hurt,
Yeah.
which is often the case.
It multiplies
in so
it
many.
in a sense.
Yeah, and it's just it's a mirror image of what happens to women who are sexually abused. In so right, well, largely this story in so many ways is about power. It's a grab for power. It's a demonstration of one's much more massive power over another.
Yeah.
But when that happens, often the person who didn't have power is forgotten. They don't get a voice, like we've already said. And then this passage, and we've already named it, causes discomfort in people. And so we don't teach it. So I think there will be a lot of Christians that if they were to go read this passage, they'll go, oh, I've never heard that. Because they've heard sermons on so many other passages, even in Genesis. But I imagine a lot of churches,
Yeah.
and they see the discomfort, they feel it, and so they don't. And it's just so interesting to me that that we're doing it to Dinah again. We're like, yeah, we still don't tell her story.
Wow.
And I told you guys as we were standing around, I was like, this feels like such an unfamiliar story. But the stories on both sides of it feel really familiar. And I think that's what we're
You mean the
talking
chapters
about.
before and the chapters? I got it. Yeah.
And what comes, and he, Jacob will be named Israel immediately after this. So it's nearby, even this huge seminal moment. But it is an unfamiliar story to Christians because of the discomfort. And so she would say that's a mirror image of what happens to abuse victims. They are forgotten. They are voiceless. They don't get to tell their story because that story will cause discomfort. And so
In others?
in other people,
Okay.
in other people, or the people who have power also have the power to silence that story, to not tell that story. And so I say that because I imagine there's listeners that if they are activated or they have their own story, it will not be strange if your experience is nobody knows that. Or no one knows that happened. Or even I don't want to share that. Or how could I share that? I think that would be a normal experience for someone who has had a sexual abuse story, a rape story.
Yes.
And that was true for Dinah too.
Yeah.
There's really no justice for her. I mean, she becomes,
And she's never mentioned after this.
No.
It's just like
Yeah.
it's done. Yeah.
and I think current statistics say out of every 1,000 who are convicted of some sort of sexual crime, only 25 end up incarcerated.
0.25%?
25, people out of every 1,000. Because of exactly what Josh
What is
was
that by
talking
math?
about.
2.5%? 2.5%.
Yeah.
Say that again. I want to make sure I understand. Out of every 1,000, go ahead. Sorry.
25 people.
Out of every 1,000 that commit sexual violence?
Yes.
Out of every 1,000 that are like not necessarily commit because not everything's reported. So out of every 1,000,
Exactly.
yes,
They're actually convicted.
That are
actually
25
convicted.
end
Yes.
up in prison.
Whoa. Okay, very good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This already feels like a very holy conversation, because of the reality of this pain in so many people's lives. The thing that I'm captured in the story is, again, just bringing the theological sense to this. Is there are so many compromises that we see as you read through Genesis. So the fact that Jacob didn't go to Bethel, like when you preached that he was, when he was leaving, God said, come back here, and he was supposed to come back. He stopped short. If you just look on a map, Shechem is short of Bethel, so he doesn't obey. This is just little hints in the theological text that there's a compromise. And so in a sense, Jacob is partly, at least partly responsible in a sense, in my understanding, that just because of his compromised obedience or his partial obedience, and he sets up this relationship with outsiders, we'll say pagans. Of course, because of Jesus and the Great Commission, we view outsiders differently. But in this story, Israel is supposed to be separate and protected in many ways. And so there's just elements of compromise. You're right. Dinah is forgotten. She's used as a pawn. The focus is on the brothers, and death seems to be the answer. But it's not the answer for Dinah. It's not the answer for the larger story. And yeah, there are so many things that are just left at the end of, again, Genesis is not supposed to be a math formula that we solve for X, right? So there's lots of things left out. Digging back in, how do you expect this, or let me rephrase the question. How have you experienced this as a counselor to people? Is this a prevalent thing, or is it, I know it's tricky, but talk just generally about how this has shown up in your counseling office. Of course, anonymously and respectfully, but this is something that you deal with a lot or not?
Are you referring to the topic of rape
Sexual
and sexual
violence and
Okay,
rape, yeah.
I would say probably 90% of the people that I was working with in a women's trauma setting was according to
Whoa.
this particular topic. Yeah. I don't know that I really had anyone that comes to mind, or any group of people that come to mind that were outside of this category.
So if there are listeners thinking that if they were here and they could just wink appear here and they would say, but isn't rape and sexual violence rare? And you would say,
Ooh, can I share some stats?
Go
please,
for it.
Yeah.
please.
Yes.
Every 68 seconds, an American is sexually assaulted. So I don't know how many 68 seconds we've been sitting here.
Quite a few.
Yeah. Every 9 minutes, one of those is a child.
Okay, let's pause for just a second. Every 68 seconds, an American is sexually assaulted.
Yeah, these are just some stats for
I
America.
got it.
Yeah.
Just for America. And every 9 minutes,
One of those is a child.
so every 8 cycles, one of them is a child.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. 1 in 3 women will be sexually assaulted in their life. 1 out of every 6 women will either be a victim of an attempted or completed rape. So 1 out of 6. So that we're talking about Dinah. So it's not rare.
How does these statistics, how do they define sexual violence? I just
Yeah.
like that you said an
Yeah.
attempted or completed rape. There's a difference.
Yeah, we break sexual abuse into 2 categories: sexual contact and sexual interactions.
Okay.
So yes, there are like 1 in 6 women experience a rape or an attempted rape. But so often sexual abuse is part of a grooming process,
Right.
where it
So it
starts.
has a longer story.
Yeah.
Longer.
And often isn't a one time. It's a repeated.
Right.
And it's a desensitization.
Yeah. Yeah. Desensitization. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Over time, so that the scary thing or the bad thing or the dangerous thing that's happening feels less scary, less dangerous. It starts to be normalized. So the victim, loses, often younger people or people in abusive situations, lose sight of the fact over the time they're being abused.
Which is clearly a part of their healing process, the reporting process, them telling their story. Because the first step is for them to see themselves actually as a victim of violence, even if it over a grooming process didn't feel like it would be if it was random. Wow, that helps so much with the larger story of what's going on in individual lives.
Yeah.
But I think that's kind of a big myth, right? That
Yeah.
these incidents happen randomly. They happen from strangers.
Yeah.
That's almost never the case.
No, only 11% of rapes are unknown, like just random attacks.
11% of
Yeah.
rapes are from someone that the victim doesn't know.
Yeah, so that means 29% of abusive events occur with family members or someone else known by the family. 60% of people who perpetrate know their victim, which is also like scary.
It's so scary and incredibly complex because this is, I think growing up, when I would hear or see rape, in some sense on a television show or in a movie, right, is probably the first time that I was like, wait a second, what is happening? I was a teenager by then, of course, and I say of course, but that's not always the case. But I remember understanding that at a certain moment in my life when I was at some level of maturity, and I had this thought that was all that it was. It was just a random act of violence against somebody that's not known by evil people, mostly men. But it was just like to hear those statistics is very unsettling.
Yeah, I think that's one of the ways that evil cultivates isolation is by this idea that it is random. Because I would say, I was actually thinking the same thing, that when I recall television shows and everything, it's like, oh, girl walking through the park.
Exactly.
Yeah,
There you go.
sensationalized.
Right.
Yes.
Instead of normal, like,
Right.
this is actually happening all the time.
Right.
And it's just like a very, very tricky tactic in order for the person who has been victimized to feel further isolated, because there's this assumption that, it's random, it's not something that other people don't know their perpetrators, etc., that it can just cause further isolation for people.
There's so many. This is it's not fascinating. I was tempted to use that word. It's the opposite of fascinating, but there's so many layers. Like you just said, the isolating effect of this event and this evil committed against someone. There's so many layers of that isolation.
Yeah.
That
Well, I think, and this is, I'm curious if you found this too, working with clients, we'll get a client in our office, we're the first person they've ever told they were sexually violated 2 years after we started seeing them.
Yeah.
And it happened 6 to 8 years ago. So it usually happens, and there's so much shame around the circumstances, and we can talk about that if it's helpful, but that they just keep it to themselves.
Yeah.
And they just try to make it go away. And so
Yeah.
our system is set up
Yes.
to not make it safe. They won't be believed. The way trauma memory is categorized or is coded in the memory, it's fragmented.
Yes.
So they're not technically a reliable witness because they remember things like out of order or
just fragments of pieces of it.
Pieces of it, things that don't make
Disconnected
sense.
pieces,
Yeah. And then when they have to go through an interrogation process, that further stress, they'll contradict themselves or they'll remember something different the next time. And so
And defense attorneys will just fill into those gaps. And, okay.
There was a great movie that came out a few years ago about a case in Linwood. It was called Unbelievable, but a man had broken in, had been stalking her, broke in, raped her. She went to the police, but because she was just she had aged out of the foster care system. Her memory of the event was very fragmented. They didn't believe her. In fact, then they started saying, "You made this up, didn't you?" And so finally she was like, "Okay, yeah, I did." Years later, this man finally gets convicted in another state. And when they are cleaning out his apartment, they find a bunch of like SD cards or like memory sticks. And he took photos of her, which is one thing that she said. And so she was finally vindicated. And it was like 10 years later.
But the whole process, she actually was convinced that she made it up.
She didn't, but like there was they were so, she wasn't being believed. And she just collapsed.
Yeah,
and so it was like, okay,
right.
I made this up. And
Which
then,
makes me think about the other thing that I often hear is particularly men hearing these stories and just assuming, oh, you led him on, you brought it on, and then you change your mind at the end, which is this really hurtful kind of, and I think very complex sort of layer to all of this as well. Oh, gosh. Yeah.
I think it's interesting. Early commentaries on this passage suggest that Dinah did something.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
She
Yeah.
shouldn't have been out alone,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
this idea
So it
that
was-
she was asking for it or like
Yeah,
set
exactly.
herself
There you
up.
go. Yeah, it wasn't
know?
all, but it was a lot of her fault.
Yeah.
All these, I imagine that you've probably experienced this less as a man counselor, but probably not zero.
Yeah, not zero.
Okay.
And often, interestingly enough, most of the groups that I lead about healthy sexuality includes men who often have been sexually assaulted. Those stories are out there. They actually are way more frequent than you think. They're way underreported. But
Men
all
as the victims of sexual
Yeah,
violence.
for
Yeah.
sure.
Men even report less.
Yes.
Than women.
Yeah.
Yes. Because it's culturally even less.
Because the shame around that, I'm sure,
Yeah.
is way, okay.
Well, even
Yes.
culturally, we have to assume a man could be victimized, that he's vulnerable enough to be victimized,
Yeah.
which that doesn't really compute with
Oh,
our
because the assumption is
social
hard for us to
norms.
make.
Yeah.
I get it. Okay.
But I think what's true when we're talking about sexual abuse, when we're talking about trust and power, in these situations where you most often usually know this person, you have a relationship. The relationship is the vehicle for the vulnerability, is that there is real trust. And that trust is used, as we said, to make you feel comfortable. And often, even the person who is abusing, they have more power. That power can look like they're older, they've had more sexual experience, they themselves are male, they have more power. And so a lot of males who have been abused, they have experienced abuse in this way that you can look back and see, oh, that person did have. But what they what they often use is even your vulnerabilities. They can see you're vulnerable, and they use that power as a way to even maybe give you something your heart did want, or attention, or delight, or aloneness, right? To do that to you. So I have spoken with many men. My office isn't necessarily for women. I have wonderful people I refer to for that. But I've had men with the same experience and they felt the shame of, I can't believe I allowed it to happen. The relationship is even a vehicle for their shame because they feel like I should have known, or it was my fault, or I said yes, when really it was a process of trust over time that was used because of the power.
Yeah, and I think that's like everything you just said, I think happens with women or with girls and women as well, that the power dynamic and the trust. And I think that's what's so like evil about sexual violation and sexual trauma is that it twists the very ways we know how to enter into relationship through trust and vulnerability and care and receiving goodness and having someone pay attention to us and affirm us. And often a perpetrator will know that this person is overlooked or not protected or is hungry for love and affection. And then that's used against you. And so that really damages and fractures the way you relate to yourself, the way you relate to other people, the way you relate to God, in numerous ways. It's not just one thing that we're quote unquote like fixing in therapy.
Yeah.
It's a holistic repair of the psyche, the body, the spiritual aspects.
And we're going to get to more of that. We want to move on to some healing truths and approaches, of course, but a little bit more, if you're a listener, hold on with us, a little bit more about just what is most misunderstood, the fog in the culture, especially in the church, about sexual violence. I have a couple more questions, and then we'll move on. But I want to know more particularly about men, because I have a friend, a godly man, teacher, father, grandfather, and known him for years, and in his late 50s was the first time that he began to speak of, grew up in a large city outside of Texas, and first time he ever began to speak of the guy the older kid that grew up in the same apartment building that would that started to groom him and then capture him on his way out under the stairwell, and this happened repeatedly and repeatedly, and he largely had to process this in absolute isolation from everyone, as far as I understand the story. And then as an adult, decades later, coming to a time where he could talk about it decades later. And so it's not the only person. Like this story, unfortunately, has touched members of our family and extended family, and lots of friends. And according to the statistics, it's undoubtedly true that I know good friends that this has happened to, that I just don't know the story, because they haven't shared it, or they haven't shared it with me. And so talk to me a little bit more about, is there anything else you would say to men listening that maybe haven't experienced this? And then I have another question before we move on. Anything else that any of you would say about, or to men listening?
Yeah, I think the misnomer is that rape or sexual violation is just for women, or like involves women or impacts women. But I think the stats say that 1 in every 6 reported cases is against a child, and 1 in every 25 is against a man. So 1 in 3, 1 in 6 for women, but 1 in 6 and 1 in 25 for males. So it's definitely
Way more prevalent
happening
than we
way
would
more
expect.
than we think. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think those stories are out there. I almost wish, if someone was listening to this and they had that story, I can only imagine the barriers that have kept someone from remembering, including that we don't want to remember those things that have happened to us. We're trying to bury them. Often I meet with men who are like, I never wanted to speak about this again. And of course not. But that those stories are out there. Even this last Sunday, we're in a men's healthy sexuality group right now, and we're sharing stories, and even the leaders are sharing their stories, and there will be multiple shared. And there was even on Sunday story of similar to what we're talking about, that this person was abused by an older male, and it took a long time for them to share it, but the amount of healing that has come from finding a space where it's really safe. I think that's maybe the biggest question, is where could I share this? Where could it be safe?
Yeah.
And that's why I'm so thankful for therapy, which is supposed to be, the safest place in the world. And I hope that that's true, and that is a place to begin. That's probably the safest place I can imagine anyone telling me that story. And I would sit there and want to hear it and say more. I want to hear more. And I think people do not want to hear more, that they'll be rejected, or the shame will be increased if they were to tell that story. And even though sexual abuse is not my story, even now I'm in therapy, and for the first time sharing some stories that I've not spoken to people, because I don't want to speak those. But the amount of healing that has come from having someone who's an advocate, who's companioning with me, who's a witness to this actually happened. There's a truth telling in telling these stories that is spiritual, that is bond breaking. And honestly, there's so much freedom to be found when you are able to speak these stories, and actually you get back kindness, you get back dignity from someone, which is all I'm trying to give to anyone. So when I hear those stories, I guess I just want to say I'm so thankful to hear those stories. I bless those persons. It is holy. It often leads to them reintegrating this big thing in their life that has been affecting them. It's in the room. It's not in the past. It's in the present every moment. And it's big because
No matter what they tell themselves,
absolutely.
it is. Yeah, got it.
And there's so much feeling around it and power behind it, largely because it hasn't been spoken. They haven't had the ability to reflect or receive. They only have condemnation and shame, contempt for themselves, or for this story, this part of themselves. And so I guess I want to say I get why it's been unspoken. I get why. I actually honor why. There's a protective thing that's happened there. And there's an invitation to speak it that I just want to say would be a leap of faith, would be a big risk, and in the right space will lead to deep healing.
I love what you just said, mate, because there's another opportunity for more condemnation when we hear a story that's decades old. That often I would expect or assume that the response is, "Why didn't you share it sooner?" Which is another. Well, okay. Great. And I love what you just said, that you understand and you have some sense of respect for why these men in particular and women don't share the story. It's very understandable. I also love that what you said earlier about the layers of isolation that happens with this, that vulnerability and honesty has the opposite effect. When one person is vulnerable about their story, like you said in your group, it has this de-isolating effect to the people around them, and they go, oh, that was safe for them. It can be safe for me too. And so we begin to unravel some of these layers. The second question I had was maybe more precise.
Can I actually just
of
interrupt?
course.
I want to also say, I just feel prompted even in this moment as you were talking, Josh, of just even saying for anyone listening, for the men that are listening, for the women who are listening, for parents of people, of children who have experienced these things, that healing is absolutely possible. That it can very much feel like, with the layers of isolation and the statistics and all the things, there was even a moment earlier where I was like, I think we need to all just take a deep breath with that, because it can feel so daunting.
Yes.
And yet,
Thank you.
healing is so possible. And it is slow work. It is, it can feel really really intimidating and daunting work. And yet I will say, even just from my experiences, that from my own story, but also clients that I have worked with, that when we can continue to take those little bites of risk to say, I'm going to say a little more, I'm going to feel a little bit more, I'm going to let that connect a little bit more, that healing is absolutely possible. And all that it really, I guess, I don't want to say all that it takes, but because that's not what I mean, but I think that healing is possible, and the isolation, and I think, I will say the work of the enemy is to cause you to believe that that is not
Yes.
possible.
Yes.
And so the isolation is
Hopelessness.
perpetuated by maybe hurtful responses and things like that. That's like, oh, this now is taking healing off of the table for me. And so I don't know where this podcast will reach, but please reach out to us at Reach. We will help you to find someone local to you that is, hopefully a very trusted person, if you're not out in the Seattle area. But yeah, I don't know. I just felt really compelled to say, like, there's hope and healing is possible. And I can say personally that on the other side of storytelling, that there is a lot of freedom, and yet there are still moments where I wrestle with, like, oh, I don't know if I can say that again. I don't know if I can tell that story again. And yet taking that small risk with a trusted individual to lean in only for me has provided more of, like, God overturning a rock and saying, like, oh, the scary thing wasn't on the underside of that. It was actually more of what you were longing for. So I don't know if that, like, that
So
makes a lot
important.
of sense, but yeah.
We will say this again at the end, but yeah, if you're in the Seattle, Kirkland area, the Reach Counseling Center, you can find our information on our website, and we'll try to link some of that in the podcast notes, but please reach out. A lot of these here in the podcast are working in that center, and we would be glad to have you. So the more specific question is a wrinkle that I just want to make sure people understand. Talk to me about marriage, inside of a marriage. I think that there's a lot of folks that assume that once I say a vow and put on a ring and am therefore married, that what happens inside of marriage is not, and probably in many ways cannot be, rape or sexual violence. But we know that happens. We know that rape can happen inside of a marriage, so that we understand Dinah's experience. It's not technically about when or if she was married or whatever. The violence can happen on either side of that. And so speak if you want about that. I feel strongly about this, want to make sure that people understand that these kinds of things can happen on the other side of a county clerk's document signed, or the other side of an altar vow, that this can happen inside of a marriage, so that listeners who are experiencing the various spectrum understanding of sexual violence and rape inside of marriage don't feel like this is disqualified as violence. Does this make sense?
Yeah, I mean, what you're talking about is domestic violence.
Okay,
Where it's
so-
not consensual, it's expected.
But when most people say domestic violence, I don't think they think about, well, at least it's not my first thought to think about sexual violence or rape inside of a marriage. They think more physical altercations, these kinds of things. But so would that be a proper understanding of domestic violence includes all of these things that we're talking about, but it's inside of a marriage?
Yeah, and I
Yes.
think it's anytime there's a lack of freedom,
Good.
and there's usually some coercion or manipulation or fear, emotional abuse, physical abuse,
Right.
or just spiritual abuse of like, you have to, because it says right here in this
Yes.
book that we both believe in,
Yes.
that you have to have sex with me. And that can go for male and female, not just, but
Yeah.
I mean, obviously I think primarily for women that's are victimized in that way, but yeah, it happens.
I just wanted to make that statement out there because I think that is maybe more underreported, more just assumed that this is what I have to do or whatever, especially, and here's the evil, I'm so comfortable using that word, the evil that twists itself into the Christian culture, into Christian marriages, into the church in a way that that I think is particularly painful and confusing
Yeah.
to people.
Well, we might want to cut this part out, but I mean, sometimes when I read the Old Testament, the number of women who get taken
Yes.
by men,
Yeah.
like, I'm gonna say, is that consensual? Is there? It's just like they have a right to the women, and so
Yeah.
it's years and years and years of seeing that play out.
Yeah. And there are. I mean, it should not come as a shock to anybody listening that there are many cultures where that is still
Yeah,
the same
exactly.
today.
Yeah.
Many cultures.
Yes.
Yeah, I feel like just taking in what you just said. I mean, I feel like that's absolutely true here. We've already talked about Dinah just being overwhelmingly overlooked.
Yeah.
But even in spiritual contexts, historically, men just have had way more rights and power, even in a marriage. And so the spiritualization we're describing, that sounds so left field, or maybe it's an outlier and extreme for someone to be like, you have to have sex with me because God's word said it. I've heard that in specific examples in
Absolutely.
counseling.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Multiple in the
Yes.
last 2 weeks.
Not an outlier.
So that's actually incredibly common. I think
Yes.
there is a historical precedent for it. And I think marriages often have an imbalance of power. That often happens in spiritual settings. That the man is maybe more believed, or the dynamic in the marriage is he makes all the decisions. He gets to say, he gets to have the opinion, he gets to have disagreement. And so I think what we're naming is actually probably way more common. I'm learning. I mean, I'm always shocked when I hear it, like, oh my goodness, that's spiritual abuse. But way more common and not that out there.
Yeah.
And has it been a part of how things have been? It's funny. I was reading Diane Langberg's book leading up to this. She has 2 books that are so powerful. One is Suffering in the Heart of God, which is about sexual abuse and how to even think of or see sexual abuse through the eyes of the scriptures and the eyes of God. But she also has done so much research.
What's the second book?
Second one is
Put you on the spot.
Redeeming Power. It's Redeeming Power. Okay, and it talks about exactly what we're talking about. How can you see it? But most of her research is on people. Like when because she's older, Diane Langberg's older, and she's like, all my research, I went to find books, I couldn't find any. They were people who had been abused. They were wives in these marriages.
Wow.
And my supervisors told me she's making it up. Like there's no source material for her, but even the response of her superiors at that time, and she of course says, I ignored them completely, but it's just, even when she describes what we're talking about being like the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and even the 90s, and even her stories today. That book, Redeeming Power, was published like 2 years ago.
Wow.
And the stories just tell you that it's so common what we're talking about. It's not out there.
Yeah.
Can we begin to turn the corner a little bit and say, if if there are victims of sexual violence in all of its many forms listening, what would you say as we begin to turn towards maybe a more healing approach, some truths? What would you say are the keys? I hesitate to even use that word. It's so complex. I understand. I'm not trying to reduce anything. What would you think are perhaps some of the priorities or the most important things for that person to understand in order to take those first steps towards healing? We've already mentioned some of them, that what has been done to you is isolating. There is shame attached to it. I want to come back to that now. I mean, not we can do that now. The isolation, the shame, the fear, all of these things that want to keep you and keep this story in the dark. What are some of those things that you'd want to clearly say to listeners or victims that are listening, or listeners who know victims? What would you want to say to them clearly? And then we can chase some of these things as we identify them.
Yeah. I'll start just by saying like you, Aaron, already started to touch on what that starts to look at. But I think taking a step toward healing from any kind of sexual assault requires you do the very thing that every fiber in your body is saying not to do,
Right.
which is to trust somebody, to be vulnerable, to take a risk. Because the last time you did that, it really hurt you. And so I think that first step is just saying, I need help. I can't do this on my own. If I could heal, I probably would have done it by now, especially for someone who's been carrying it like your friend for a long season. But yeah, just that, like, who is somebody trusted that I could tell, whether that's a friend, a therapist, a spouse, a pastor, and then just doing the next thing.
Yeah.
It strikes me it makes me emotional because so much of our relationship with God is faith, which is trust.
Yeah.
And it would be so evil for the enemy to use situations and people against a soul to make them not willing to trust. It sounds so calculated on a spiritual level.
Yeah.
And it
I
breaks
love
my heart.
Dan Allender's categories of faith, hope, and love.
Yes.
It destroys your ability to, faith,
To trust.
to trust, but also
Takes hope away.
what you thought life was going to be, or what you thought your life was going to be.
Okay.
So
Kills the dream.
Yeah, and then hope. How do you have a future? How do you believe in goodness and that there's future goodness? And then love, like how do you receive love? How do you
Experience
be
intimacy
loved?
and all,
And
all
how
the
do you
things.
love others? So it mars all of those things. And honestly, the enemy doesn't have to work very hard to keep you bound. He just uses the things that happens to you and gets in there with further lies and distortions.
Wow. Thank you.
Yeah. I think when it comes to taking that risk, I also think of like when you step out and share a story, even this is a little bit more practical, but even having caring things that surround that event. Don't go tell someone the story and then go to work. Don't go tell someone the story and then go home and have to make dinner for all of your family. I think really padding that particular choice to tell the story with sort of I don't like the phrase self-care. It drives me crazy because it's just so cultural hot
Yeah, I got it.
kind of things. But
Yeah.
padding yourself with caring and nourishing things that hold sacred the act of telling that story.
Can we say soul care, perhaps?
Yes, yeah.
In a better way.
Because I think this is kind of my vulnerable share, but like in telling aspects of my own story that I held on to until I was in my 30s, I did not make sure to care for myself in that way. And so it was kind of like a sharing, and then there's a rawness. It's kind of ripping off a Band-Aid is a very rudimentary way to say it, but there's like a rawness and an exposure that you likely will feel after sharing that. And so having things that sort of hold that in sacredness, having the day off, or I know these are all really practical
No,
things,
that's what
but
we want.
I think it's really helpful, because I think, again, like we're talking about with isolation or further evidence, quote unquote, that we might take as evidence that, oh, I shouldn't have shared, can sometimes happen immediately after
Shares
sharing.
remorse, the
Yeah.
double
Yeah.
shame.
And so having some of those really, I just think of padding, I guess. That's just the image that keeps coming to mind. Those things that kind of pad the before and after, bookending, that kind of thing. Knowing that it's very normal for your body to respond in a self-protective way in that moment. Knowing it's very normal for even your mind to like want to run away from the thoughts and feelings and things that come up in that moment. And even as a person who might be receiving the story from somebody else, that might be something that your body does too. And so having just some really helpful, caring things that can happen afterwards, quiet, being near water, being in nature, whatever things, those
Beauty.
kinds of things that
Yeah.
can really be helpful to sort of letting the like, there be a little bit of runway after that particular choice, because that's so brave, and you want to maybe be mindful of the ways the enemy might want to snatch that immediately after to make it see you shouldn't have done that,
Yeah, good.
because then it just makes it harder and harder to share again.
Good.
So
Yeah.
Yeah.
That kindness, that compassion,
Yes, yeah.
you know, and being gentle with ourselves. We tend to be
absolutely.
really harsh
yeah,
with ourselves,
Yes.
really impatient, really critical. And so
yeah,
I think just that shift in learning to see ourselves how Jesus sees
right,
us
yeah, compassion
is hard, but I think that's what
Yeah.
you're talking about.
absolutely.
And I don't want to over compare men and women in this regard, but I think men particularly struggle with that because of their sense of having to be strong, having to be a leader,
Be a man
etc.
about it.
Yeah, for
Yeah.
for those for men to admit it, I know I struggle with so much of just like I'm not living up to my own expectations, and I have to realize my expectations are way out of proportion to God's and my wives and my children, my wife's, my children's expectations of etc. Any thoughts to just share? Big picture other than what's been shared.
Yeah, I'm thinking of that personalization of shame, like it's my fault, and I'm imagining, like, did Dinah think it was her fault? Like how, like when she thinks about going to the well that day, like did she have a sense of, I wish I hadn't gone, I wish I had.
There you go.
But there's always so much more to the story.
Yeah,
Like there's such a, I'm honestly, when I read this, what I was thinking was, who's supposed to be protecting her right now?
Yeah.
Because you get the sense from the reading, she's young, and she goes alone to do this and ends up in an incredibly vulnerable situation.
And I think culturally, we're supposed to read that as a vulnerable situation.
Yes.
We're supposed to read that, go, oh, she shouldn't be there.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And when you sit with people who have stories of abuse, we often even just talk about the setup,
Yeah.
the conditions that were present for the abuse to happen, even though you feel might be your fault, is often not at all your fault.
Okay, that's important to say because I imagine a lot of these folks would say, this happened to me. And then I look back as I think about it on an endless, infinite loop for decades and decades. They probably have a way of convincing themselves that the problem was theirs.
Yeah.
They did it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They were responsible.
Yeah, and when you think about even just like abuse, like I mean, often we think of power doing bad, using power towards someone else, but one of the biggest forms of abuse we know is having power and doing nothing with it, having passive power. And she probably had people with power to protect her in her life or instruct her, you cannot go there alone, or I will go with you and accompany you.
Yeah.
Or any amount of instruction that she didn't have that left her in a vulnerable situation. That's part of the storytelling and all of this. And when I read the story, I get mad at Jacob too.
Oh, yeah, me too.
This is, I mean, we've heard him be passive so many times.
Yes. Yeah.
And he doesn't enter in. We don't hear or get to see him at all respond to Dinah. his brothers do respond, and he's passive towards them. Even he's not even, he's not even active in what they do next. He's angry at them, but you get that sense when you read Dinah's story that there are people around who did not protect her, and that's probably present in these stories too. I actually enjoy, even though it's hard for people to acknowledge that, I enjoy that part of storytelling because even as a parent, I dropped my daughter off in a cornfield with the youth group this last week, and I felt uncomfortable, but I also did a lot of planning, right? And she wasn't alone, and we made sure she got to the person because she's in the middle of a cornfield in this rural place with hundreds. So I just think as a parent, even for me, I'm in that situation thinking and feeling I need to protect my daughter from vulnerability. And someone didn't feel that or felt that and did nothing about it in Dinah's case.
I would say, I want to move on to shame in just a second because we mentioned that. I want to talk more about that. I would say to people who are listening who are not maybe victims, or pastors or leaders, lay counselors, we will say, just prayer partners who may be accessing or accepting these kinds of stories. I stumbled upon this. This was not my training or wisdom. That's a story of my life, actually. I stumbled upon a lot of these things. I remember someone sharing a story in a situation in a counseling kind of environment, a pastoral care environment, we would say more accurately. And it was so vulnerable. I felt God say to me, do not speak, do not answer, do not reply. So all I said was, this is such a special moment. I said, I just think let's just be silent for a second. And it freed me from the ability to have something to say with there was nothing to say. There was no real response other than, wow, thank you for trusting me. Thank you for saying that out loud. There's power in saying that out loud. I just wanted to recognize the holiness of that moment and the courage that it took and just say thank you. Just say thank you. And I want to give that as an opportunity. Like, I didn't know that was a tool available to me early on in pastoral ministry. I didn't know that I could just say nothing and just say thank you. Again, language in the culture, but I see you. I hear your story and thank you. And just let it be. Obviously not forever. We can come back to that. We can invite more vulnerability and trust, but just to say thank you. And I having been a pastor for decades now, I know the great temptation, particularly for pastors, I know the great temptation to, because I've not been in your situation in a counseling office, and I'm sure the temptation is there too, but for pastors, the temptation is to have an answer, to have the next step, to have some process or progress that we show. And for pastors listening, I just want to say, one, that can come later. Two, let the Holy Spirit do that. Three, don't press because you're a type A leader. Don't press into that, making sure that we have to take some steps today. Sometimes the vulnerable sharing is a massive step, or probably always is a massive step that we should just celebrate and let be. And so for those that are not victims listening, you have lots of tools at your disposal, and you're not alone in this. If you're a believer, you're especially not alone. Does that make sense? Anything wrong in what I just said?
No, not at all.
Dangerous? Okay, good.
I feel like I learned years ago, my supervisor in school said the acronym or the word WAIT is an acronym. It's why am I talking? And I actually have held on to that over the years because there is a real temptation, I think, no matter what kind of leader that you are, whether it's pastoral or in a counseling office, there's the temptation, the desire, oftentimes even coming out of a place of care, to want to say something that will help this person.
Yes.
sometimes that's not our motivation, but I think a lot of times that is, and knowing that those kinds of things will come eventually. But this moment of sharing is sacred and holy, like
Yeah.
you were saying.
Why am I talking?
Yeah.
I love that.
And oftentimes I think even on the receiving end, as a person sharing a story, I think it can be really, it feels really invalidating and really can be really destructive when that space is filled with words, because then it often will crowd the story out.
Yep.
Because now whatever the explanation is and whatever's happening after that is crowding out the vulnerability that it took to get to that place.
And two,
So-
just learning how to listen. You know,
Yeah.
I mean, like I'm convinced. I know I was guilty of this and still am for most of my life. I keyed into one thing that you just said, and now I'm just waiting for you to stop talking so that I can speak to that one thing. I've stopped listening, you know, and it's so prevalent, I think, and that's sad. The spiritual direction movement, I thank God so much that it's sort of going through a revival now as a way of speaking to a felt need, and of the spiritual directors that I've sat with and worked with and are learning from, they have something similar than wait. It's 3 S's. Spiritual direction. You go slow, you're silent, and you're stupid. The stupid means that you just ask a lot of questions. What did you mean by that? Tell me more about that, right? You go slow. There is no rush. You're comfortable with silence, and you just ask a lot of questions, which I think is really helpful. Let's talk about shame. You said that shame, of course, plays a huge role in this. Tell me more about that, Amy. Talk just wide open.
Yeah, I was thinking when Josh was talking about Dinah just now, that in this story, she carries all the shame, and her perpetrator is shameless. And how that is so often how the victim feels. They're the ones carrying all the shame. And there's usually this idea of carrying some responsibility. Or the shame of like, I should have seen it coming, or I should have been able to do something. You know, a lot of victims freeze. They can't, they become powerless. So yeah, there's so many ways shame can attack. And really, that can be, I think shame is probably the biggest. There's what's happening to the body, but there's also how that is connected with these messages of you are not enough, and you did this, you're bad.
Yeah.
And so to then that just becomes so can become so enmeshed in the belief system about self that sometimes that's harder to get over than anything else. What would you add?
Sorry, it kind of took my breath away a little bit, that the shame is more damaging.
Because Go ahead.
There's more on this topic in the scriptures than I think we know or know. I was honestly, when you said that, what I actually was thinking was Tamar's words when she is raped, and she says, I'm going to be emotional as I share it, but when she says, how will I get rid of my disgrace?
Yeah.
She asked that question when she's sent away after. And Justin Holcomb wrote a book on that called
This is David's daughter, Tamar, you're
Yes.
talking about. Yeah, I got it. Later on, just for context. Excellent.
Yes,
Excellent.
David's daughter Tamar. And she asked that question, and as she is sent away, and that the shame of it all is often being born in such a heavy way that it is more damaging. It's somehow even more, and that feels so sinister. That feels of Satan. That feels like so lie-giving. That person is the badness. They're often handed the isolation. They're handed this thing that happened that they will carry in silence. And there's just something so sinister about that will have even more destruction and harm to the person than even maybe the event or what happened to their body, or that the shame is this compounding thing that they now have to live with and hold and carry. And so
We talk about this. Shame has this wider thing. Even with divorce, with abuse as a child that wasn't sexual in nature, with failure, with certain sins, et cetera, et cetera. But when it comes to sexual violence, there's an embodied experience of that shame, which I think makes the shame experience a little bit sharper, like you're saying, that was to my body, and I can't get out of my body. And the fact that the church also misunderstands God's purpose and glory and holiness of the body adds to that. There's a dualistic, Gnostic kind of undertone in the church that God's only interested in the spirit, not in the body. But no, Jesus came in the body. We're resurrected in a body, which is the only evidence that we need that God values the body. We are embodied souls, or ensouled bodies, or whatever you want to say. And so the shame is, you're right, so much in the scriptures about the shame and the effects of shame in all these ways. But when it comes to sexual violence, it seems to sharpen it for me because of the sin against the body.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I don't think that can be underemphasized. It's so
But the church doesn't
important.
talk about it enough.
Well, and we can't
Pastors don't talk about it
think
enough.
our way into healing from sexual trauma.
Say that again.
We
can't.
cannot think our way. We can't just believe the right things or know
There
the
you
right
go.
things. We actually have to have embodied experiences
There you go.
of receiving healthy love and care.
Yeah.
And I think
Should we see that as an unraveling of what has been knotted, or just is that a proper way of seeing it? These embodied experiences that are positive,
Yes.
that redeem the
Yeah.
faith, hope, and love that has been attacked?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's actually what creates the healing, is having new experiences that creates new neural pathways in the brain.
There you go. Yeah. Good.
But when we think about God is love, and our whole purpose as humans is to love and be loved, first our God and then by one another, that shame attacks that. And when you, especially if you were groomed over a period of time, God designed our bodies to come alive with care and touch and pleasure and delight. If somebody takes delight in you, it's like it warms your heart.
Yeah.
Like, we're built for that.
Yes.
And that gets so distorted and used and just devastated, because the good things that we were created for and to experience are what ended up hurting us terribly. And so, how will I get rid of my shame? It's not just to the body, but it's your whole purpose.
Yeah.
Of like, how do I now find love when that's been so marred?
There's been a lot of writing recently. It seems like in my non-infinite experience of all of the things that have been written, obviously, but it seems like shame has been the topic of a lot of books over the last 20 years or so. I celebrate that. I haven't read them all, of course, and I hope that they're true. But it sure seems like shame is a topic that is growing in size and depth, and I celebrate that. Anything to add?
No, I don't think so. I think I love the emphasis that we're putting, the language that we're putting around that, shame isn't just like feeling bad about XYZ. It's this really lived experience. It's this really deep, almost inexplainable experience.
It's an embodied belief system.
Yeah.
I am bad. It's like becomes the undercurrent.
Yeah.
I am broken. I am
I'm
bad.
not good enough.
Yeah.
And I can't ever get good
Right.
enough.
Yeah.
Which in humility, we can say, yes, that's so true of us. That's why we have Jesus. We're never going to be good enough for anything. So that's your normal garden variety.
Right.
But where sexual trauma just makes that even more difficult.
Yeah. There's also this element of it that I think I used to talk with clients often about how some of our positive emotions have similar feelings to negative emotions. So excitement and anxiety feel very similar.
Right.
Things like that. So then, what we're talking about
Brain
is really
chemistry is very similar too, probably in some sense.
Yeah, or like anger and ecstasy. Like there's these like seemingly like, oh, I don't want to feel the rage, and yet when I'm feeling ecstasy in this moment, or pleasure with a spouse or something, it has this like tint of something else that I'm trying to not feel.
Right.
Or when I'm feeling excited,
Yeah.
I'm shaky because I'm excited, but that also feels like anxiety.
Yeah.
And so
fear.
it's this like really tricky undoing of learning even to recognize those, I want to say simple, just in the sense of cues that we want to notice, but like what we're talking about, I think is just really important, even to validate people's experience, that it's not simply putting, you know, a helpful Bible verse on my bathroom
Oh, there
mirror.
you go.
That is a beautiful part
Sure,
of
sure,
healing.
sure. Yes.
But that's not the thinking aspect is, I think, what we continually go after in church settings or
To
in
think our way out of this.
yeah,
problem.
like
Yeah.
You
these
just
are,
believe
this
the
is
right
what is
thing.
true
Believe
about
the
this,
right thing.
whatever. This is your identity statements, and I'm like, yes. And how do we draw that into our bodied experience?
Yeah.
That requires much slower, tender care, and to really understand and feel the like different cues of what is actually happening.
It makes me think of Henry Nouwen, which we talked about recently in his book, The Beloved, how he says it is one thing to believe that you are the beloved of God. It is a wholly different thing to be
Yeah.
and live as the beloved.
Yeah.
And so without, and far be it from me to be reductionistic in any sense, but as you are talking with and helping, walking with victims of sexual violence, do you have a roadmap that you sort of want to, and I know each story is different, and I trust that we work with each story and soul and embodied soul in front of us as the Lord leads it and as is necessary, but is there a skeletal structure of a roadmap to help people walk through this process, or is it different than that? This is a real question in ignorance. You as licensed counselors, you have a lot of experience with this. Do you have a sort of a skeletal roadmap that you walk through people with, or not?
I'd love it if you two would answer. I feel like you have done this work.
Yeah, I think that you just listen to the story, and then you're really assessing. I mean, each person responds differently. So when we were talking about how we hold the stories of others, as clinicians, we're also seeing, okay, what do they need? Are they highly activated right now, or are
Right.
they completely disassociated?
Okay, in
Did
the
they
moment.
just give me data and they have no feeling? So
Okay,
then
okay.
that'll tell you which path you're
Okay.
like, oh, okay, we need to learn how to regulate our big feelings
Mm-hmm.
of distress in order to like skill build in some ways, so that they can do that deeper work of, in some ways, coming clean. Like, how is this impacting everything? Or what are all the ways that this is impacting me? But for someone who is disassociated, they don't feel anything about what happened, but it's coming out in other ways, that's a different pathway.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you're picking up clues
Yeah.
in how they're presenting in front of you, to use medical language, and then you're choosing different pathways based on those presentations.
And then it's following the client, because they might be able to tolerate talking about the violation or how it's impacting them for a session, and then we might not come back to it for 2 months. It's this kind of slow and layered work,
Yeah.
but just trusting that, I think healing is intuitive. God's always moving us towards healing. Even the body is fiercely self-healing, and it will move people towards the highest level of functioning. So we are
Pushes
entrusting.
the splinter out in a way. Yeah.
Exactly. That's a great illustration. So we're trusting that's happening, and we're just companioning along with this person who is in the process of like exploring, like, how do I heal from this? What do I need?
I love that answer so much more than we go from A to B and from B to C.
It would be easier if that was
No,
absolutely.
I think it would be
For both
false and
parties.
fake in a sense, and so I
Yeah.
get that. How
I was going to say something very similar in the sense of like, what is the impact of this on their day to day? Because until they can feel a sense of safety, or even, I loved how you were talking about coming clean, kind of moving some of the ick out, unclogging the drain a little bit, so to speak. there's not going to really be a capacity to be able to address the deeper things that are the root of what are all of these other pieces at the top. We did use this like drain analogy quite often, that
Like a sink drain.
yeah, and it's kind of gross, and it would be kind of
that's all right.
humorous with my clients, just like, ew, and I'm like, yeah, that's how it all feels, like kind of thing. But like really that there's these little pieces of healing that happen to make way for the larger pieces of our story that maybe don't feel accessible when we first enter into that process of healing. So like you were saying, really kind of evaluating where they're presently at. How does this impact their present day? How does this impact their work life or their parenting life or whatever? And oftentimes I think that there are some smaller, I just say that like for lack of a better word, but like smaller things that we can attend to that sort of help to take these like little weights off, and then they're able to feel more free to access the thing that that maybe felt inaccessible in the beginning, which was telling the fullness of it, or how it deeply impacts my life with my spouse, or whatever it is. How I long to be free of these embodied statements of shame, but I can't name those things until some of these little pieces have been taken off, and I'm able to kind of operate in my life in a little bit more of a free way. So similar, not necessarily a framework, but just kind of seeing like, how do they move? What are the things that they can't access? I'm a very visual person, so we'd use a lot of analogies of like, is the faucet like all the way on and everything is just overflowing at all times, or is the faucet off completely and nothing's coming in, like you were saying, sharing the data. And so how are we navigating some of those things of giving them more access so that they're able to really attend?
How do you know when to press? I use that word and it's not perfect. When to gently press in, or to ask more of your client sitting in front of you, rather than just follow at their speed? Because I'm sure there's a little bit of a dance between that, right? We don't just go. Sometimes we ask, hey, can you give me a little bit more? What about that? How do you know when to do that? That still.
I'm like offended by your question.
Oh.
Do you feel that?
What?
Do you feel that?
Offended?
Like a little bit, because they've been violated. They've been intruded upon.
Oh.
And so that's part of what happens in the violation. And so we don't want to do that to them.
See, I'm so glad I asked it.
And so part of it is, yes, we want to challenge, but in a way
didn't mean to offend you.
Oh, I'm not really offended, but I just felt like, no. But
Good,
we want to
good.
expand their capacity to wonder of how might this be impacting you? And when they are putting up the resistances, it's because they're not ready. There's something that's too scary they're not ready yet.
Got it.
And so, so I think that's where
I'm glad I
felt,
asked.
and it's part
Good.
of them is we're teaching them to trust themselves.
Yeah.
To want to speak about it, not to be a good client and do it because we want them to, but because they're like, no, it's time, it's ready. And so sometimes it's the nudging of, I think you're stronger than you think, but not much more than that.
Okay.
What would you add? Sorry.
No, I would, that actually was part of even the initial aspects of welcoming them into my office, would say, hey, you can say no to me. I know that maybe you're like, why are you telling me that? But you're allowed to say, I don't want to answer that question. You're actually allowed to ask me why I asked a question.
You're reinstating their agency.
I'm helping them.
Good.
And I sometimes, depending on the client, would sometimes say, like validating that, I want to give you the most choice in here because I recognize that maybe is not part of your story.
Your choice was taken from you. In the
And
past,
so in here, I hope that you can come to feel the safety and the even welcoming from me, that you can say, I don't like that question. Or, I've had some of my clients interact with me in that way, saying, that feels really personal, and like kind of, and feeling the freedom to say things like that to me because they have come to know that won't offend me, that's actually what I want to see them do. I want to see them exercise those things. And yes, I want access to those topics eventually and have us walk through that. But the initial learning to have a voice in this space, I think is really important. And so I think that there is a trickiness to the pressing in, because you don't want to perpetuate their experience like we're talking about.
Well,
know,
hopefully we
yeah.
redeemed my inconsiderate question.
No, it's
I
not
think it's a
inconsiderate.
great
It's a good
question.
question.
I think it is a good question.
Because people,
Yeah.
I'm sure people, I was thinking that as you were explaining working with your client. I'm jesting with you, Amy. But it's important to know that, yes, agency has been taken. They've been forced. Now this process of walking with someone is about reinstating that, giving them a
Yeah.
say, giving them a voice, making sure that, and allowing them to use it. This
Well,
is
I
really
would
good.
say forced or tricked.
Explain.
So that's often what happens with grooming is you think one thing is going on and then something switches and you get tricked.
Okay.
So then it's
so you want
hard.
to stay far away from tricking
Yeah.
or getting
Yeah.
getting them to feel tricked
Yeah.
or manipulated.
Yeah.
Very good. Very good.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think too, under all of this is deep, deep grief about what happened to them. And shame prevents us from feeling the grief that we need to grieve over what happened. And
How does shame prevent the processing or feeling of grief?
because if you believe that it's part of you caused it, that you must have wanted it, or like sometimes you're actually told,
This is your fault.
This is your fault. You did this. You egged it on. Like you used that illustration. Like you led me on.
Yeah.
If you're carrying shame because you think it's your fault, then you can't also be sad about it. Can't
Yeah.
hold both.
Yeah.
Imagine a lot of date rape situations. That is a
Yeah, I shouldn't have gone to that party, or I shouldn't have like
There you
had
go.
all those drinks, or I shouldn't have worn this short mini skirt, or I should. It's like no, none of that is your fault.
yeah.
Yeah, a lot of grief is mourning the loss of something that we believed was ours.
Yeah.
And if there's shame there, then that particular thing to grieve, like innocence or these identity statements, are no longer ours because we believe that this is actually who I am. So there's something wrong with me. I brought it on myself. I'm not innocent in this, and so I can't grieve innocence because actually that's not who I am.
Yeah.
So there's
Wow.
this distortion.
And we see that in the
grief.
garden. We don't
Yeah.
see Adam and Eve crying. We see them hiding in shame.
Yeah. This is Aaron and I both have been, or at least I have. We've talked about it. I've been reading a lot about just lament as a lost art,
Yeah.
a lost language in the church, and this feels really appropriate. So I'm hearing you say in a recap, and then we can move on unless you have anything to add, mate. That the roadmap that you have is led by them, the client and their story and their willingness to say, a re-engagement of agency and a giving them a freedom to re-express some of these emotions that they did not express, mostly including in a highway grief, lament, the loss of what was
Yeah,
taken from them,
rage.
anger,
Often,
rage,
especially in
all
the
the things.
church, anger is not welcome.
Good. That leads me to the next question. Great. The church, and again, I'm a church guy. The church, besides Jesus in my family, is like my great love. The local church, in all of her warts and failures, the church hasn't done a good job. I would feel free to say, in a lot of ways. Okay, and for a long time. But what would you say that the church should do that she hasn't done? How should the church grow and respond better? What can the church do to better speak to this kind of experience and story? Wide open question.
I think creating spaces for it to be named. I think it's wild that it feels so rare. Not just the story from the scriptures, but people might even feel like, oh, sexual assault. Wow, no, that I've heard that.
That doesn't happen
happens to
very
some
often.
people.
Yeah.
And the statistics show that it's
common.
it's huge. I mean, what is it? Near 1 in 3 women before the age of 18. So, I mean, when you're in church on a Sunday such a huge portion of that room has faced sexual assault or rape. And we just feel like, no, I'm the only one, is the experience people embody, feel, walk with the rest of their life. So creating spaces, we have groups right now at Reach, even this week that met, the Try Softer groups, which goes through Andy Kolber's resource, Try Softer, which is largely about holding, knowing your body, your anxiety, speaking these stories from your timeline. Women shared this week, I've never shared this. Here's this story. Wow. And every time that happens, someone in the room goes, me too.
Wow.
But we just think we're alone in it.
Yeah.
That's happening in the men's group, that's happening in the women's group. So I think creating spaces, which is hard, you have to create a culture, you have to create a lot of safety. There's a lot of setup for those, make sure that the closed, aren't wandering in and out of them. There's a commitment to confidentiality, but once the spaces are created and people can, you don't have to plunge all the way in. If they can even crack open the door a little bit, I can be a little bit more vulnerable. I can share a little bit more in trust. I'm very passionate about creating those spaces. I wish the church had more spaces like that. I want more spaces. So few people sign up for those groups. They do fill, but it ends up feeling like 15 to 20 people. And then,
but they probably should be a little small, right?
They have to be. They are small environments. Okay. We could have so many more groups. I love every person that's in that's taking a very brave and bold step, because there's a readiness for it too that you need to have. But I just mean to say, every time I'm in those groups, I'm always thinking about who's not there. I'm always thinking there's worship happening right up in the hill in the chapel, and there's hundreds and hundreds of people in that room, and so many of them. Maybe they're not ready, or maybe they couldn't say yes yet, but I wish they were here too, because so many of us actually do need these spaces. They're not outliers. They're not for the broken. They're not for the people who are the most broken.
There you go.
Or
the most wounded, the most messy, the most whatever.
Exactly. So I think normalizing and finding ways to make these spaces real is huge.
I know that the individual has a choice to join the group, but why don't you think more churches have these kind of groups available?
They don't have people to lead them. We don't staff. Like, churches don't, like, your gospel care person is, like, if you have a lean staff, that's kind of maybe the first to go. Or if you have to downsize, or your church planning. And so I think we have to staff for it, because it's when you use the term pastor, really they're either a shepherd or a teacher. So often if you have a small church, you have a teacher.
Yeah.
That's their primary gifting, not shepherd.
Right.
And that the pastor is trying to fill both roles. And that's actually not their strength. And so I think for church leadership to know, like, okay, who is our gospel care person, and what have we empowered them to do? And I think, like, Reach has done a great job. Like, you were just talking earlier about the gospel care video series that you guys did, and doing the groups, and, like, hiring a licensed mental health counselor. I think that's huge, because that is a top-down change in culture.
Yeah. Good.
Yeah. That's the exact phrase that was in my mind, was top-down. I think that when our leaders are living lives that are validating our stories, being vulnerable, leaning into those things, it's the act of making disciples, like, kind of in a different context. As a disciple maker, for me, like, I am maybe investing into someone, and the hope is that person will then invest into someone, and it multiplies, right? And so as leaders, if we're leading in vulnerability and leading in truth telling for our stories, and putting language to things, and wrestling through, hey, there's parts of my story that I don't like telling, and, like, being just really honest and sharing. I think as we do that with people, and people see that they have permission, it's that same multiplication effect that when we have churches, and I don't say this as a criticism, I don't know church structures in other churches, and I'm not criticizing leadership, but I think that it's important to have the value of vulnerability and storytelling, and what we're talking about be in the leaders. If it's not with one another, it's in some kind of context where, like what we're saying, for people, find someone that's trusted in those kinds of things. Are we doing that ourselves? Are we telling our story And there's no shame in if I say no to that question. It's just, that's curious. I wonder why. And we kind of lean into that. I think that that's why a lot of churches maybe don't do these kinds of things, because I think that the value is not there to like tell my story, because we're swimming in the culture that we're all swimming in, right? That's just saying, keep that to yourself. And so I think a lot of places allow that to be silent, allow that to be, we're going to skip over chapter 34 because it's uncomfortable and we don't want to go there.
Yeah.
And so we're just perpetuating this like silence that we ourselves are living in, instead of, I'm going to enter in and say, I actually don't know how to read this chapter, but we're going to do it together as a church. Like, I think we just need more risk taking in vulnerability, in leadership.
And
So.
I think it takes the desire to hear those stories.
Yes.
And has the church really desired to hear those stories?
Exactly.
I think historically, if we're talking about power, the church has had a tendency to protect itself as a system. And stories like this feel messy, feel unpredictable, or even challenge that power. And so there is a huge trend consistently across the history of the church in Western America that has held down or silence these stories, and it's definitely not had a posture of, I want to hear those stories. Can we hear those stories?
Only as dangerous as an inactive volcano, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I say that because I went on a honeymoon with my wife to Costa Rica, and we were underneath Arenal, this beautiful volcano, and hot springs there, and I was talking to people, and at night we were there, and you could see the gentle glow. And I said, why aren't you scared living under a volcano? And they said, oh, as long as there's activity at the top, we are perfectly safe. We all leave when it stops, because when it stops, it's still building, and there's going to be an explosion, and that's when bad things happen. And so I've been thinking of that so many different ways. When it comes to the church, if we're talking about these things, if we're modeling and leading it, I think that that's probably really, really safe and good. When we stop talking about it, it doesn't necessarily mean, but I fear that it means we're hiding, we're fearful, and then the explosion comes, perhaps in some of these really terrible news cycle worthy kind of things, right? And so I hesitate to tell the story because it's about me, and I'm no hero or anything like that, but we had a recovery program at our church, a bit like Celebrate Recovery, but more biblical. In a sense, it was created by a church in Dallas, Texas, and the church I served at previously, and it was basically a 9 to 11 month Bible study, small group recovery program, wide open for all kinds of different issues. And because of God was teaching me certain things, trouble was caused. I caused my own trouble in some ways in leadership, and I was trying to figure this out. So I entered the recovery program at the church that I was a senior pastor at, right? And I had some leaders come to me and go, ooh, do you think that's a good idea? And I was like, what do you mean? They were like, well, we don't want the lead pastor, we want the senior pastor going in a recovery program at our church. And I'm like, I'm not an addict. I don't have these things that I'm embarrassed about. I'm going because I really am controlled a lot by people pleasing and approval seeking and fear, and I don't understand how this is affecting me. I need to understand this. And when I did that, I did it silent. I didn't tout myself as some sort of hero or whatever. People would see me in group and were like, are you a part of this? And I'm like, yeah. And I would tell them why. And we found, again, this is my hesitation, we found that attendance increased, and people go, oh, wait, maybe that's for me too. Maybe that's for me too. And then we started telling the stories of those people. And I remember the first day, and this was led by one of the pastors on our staff. First day, we lined up a group of people on our stage, and they gave their very short, like 7-second testimony. And when a person said on stage, recovery from rape, and then another woman said, shame over a past abortion on stage in front of hundreds and hundreds of people, that was a seismic shift moment. And people began to come out and say, whoa, if they can tell that story, I need to find a way to tell my story.
Yeah, we normalize being human. I mean, that's part of the problem is we're supposed to be like superhuman or like less than human. But as we become more like Jesus, we actually become more human.
Yeah.
And we become okay with our humanity and like, yeah, why do I keep doing this? I want to learn why instead of like shame and criticism and trying harder to whip ourselves into shape because we think God's like looking down and like waiting for us to get our act together. We have all these.
So I say all that to say we bounce off each other when I asked my question, and you responded as a counselor with the experiences, and then your response triggered me, and I was like, oh, my people pleasing. I did something wrong. I just offended a lady that I just met, and I really respect it. I'm so worked up about it. Moving on from church, like we talked specifically to victims, people who have been sinned against, experienced this. We've talked a little bit about church. Tell me about if you're a family member, a friend, a spouse of someone who has been touched by sexual violence. Speak to those individuals. How would you encourage, counsel them to enter into this story, which can be difficult as a family member, particularly if your experience of sexual violence is inside the family. Maybe not obviously with that person, but if someone went through a failed marriage or multiple failed marriages and there was violence or lack of agency, and then they get married again. You're the spouse now. If you're a family member, if you're a good friend, you're walking with somebody for decades, and then they begin to tell you their story. I imagine a lot of these men and women are, I don't know how to enter into that. And they probably, I would assume, maybe it's false, but I would assume that their immediate posture would be go, ooh, no, I'm not touching that. I'm not going to ask. I'm not going to talk. Speak to those people that might be listening.
I think to always have in your back pocket the thank you for telling me that. That must have been awful for you. And I just want to honor that you told me that you could say just that.
And thank you for trusting me with that.
Thank you for trusting me. The other things, well, I think, I don't mean to kind of like, you'll know what to say, but I think that the other things come eventually. But what is initial is I don't think that a person, when they're sharing their story, if you say those things, they're going to feel held. They're going to feel loved. They might have a lot of other feelings going on. But knowing that in that very moment, all you have to do is just kind of hold that space with them. And by that, I mean like not filling it with words, just kind of letting that be what they share. You don't have to have the solutions or the answers to those things. Even as counselors, we don't have all of the solutions and answers to those things.
Right.
We just have techniques in how to help people move through it. But I think that for a person who is sharing their story, when they're met with that compassion and what their heart is longing for, like we were talking about earlier with when we take that risk and then the things that we long for we don't get that because we get criticism from someone when we share. When we are gentle with people as they share, it's doing kind of the tender little heart repairs in them. Oh, this person didn't respond the way that I feared. Oh, this person didn't say to me the thing that I was afraid that they would say. What were you wearing? Whatever it is. I think that having in like your very first response, thanking them for sharing, like you said, thanking them for trusting you, and just empathizing, that sounds awful. Don't be afraid to cry with people. Don't be afraid to just like match and mirror like what it is that they are sharing. It's not to get too like into the clinical weeds, but there's this like co-regulation that can happen where as they're sharing and their heart is beating really fast and they're terrified inside, you meeting with a calm and welcoming presence helps to regulate and downshift the like that's happening in them, all the
Yeah.
triggers, all of the things.
Yeah.
And I learned this as a therapist, but I think that it's for anyone, is that our presence can often be the best thing for people. It usually is. Just being present to what they're sharing and not feeling like you have to be the expert on anything, except for just loving someone, I think is a good, not only, but a good first or maybe first few steps
Yeah.
with people. Yeah.
Yeah, I love what you said. And I think in addition to that, it's knowing what your presence is. So if you're a highly anxious person, you don't want to meet their anxiety with
More anxiety.
with more anxiety of, so, because sometimes people don't tell because they don't want to make another person feel bad.
Sure.
Right.
If I share my story, then now it's going to be, all that ick's going to be on them. Or sometimes they have told their story, but then they ended up having to take care of the person that they told.
Yeah.
So knowing what is
Yeah.
your presence, what are you offering them? Because it's not just being present with them, it's being present with them in a certain way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it takes practice. Like, you're going to mess it up
Oh,
sometimes.
totally. Yeah. And when I said mirror, I didn't mean mirror in the sense of if they're freaking out, freak out
out.
too.
No.
I just
Good.
mean
Yeah.
like
Reading
maybe
them.
mirror wasn't the right
But you're
word,
reading,
but
you're
you're
tuning to them.
yeah.
Tuning to
If they are saying something deep and sad, you're not smiling. Like
Yeah.
that's what
I
I mean.
understand.
Like you're
Yes,
mirroring
yes,
kind of
yes.
the moment, I guess.
You're reading appropriately.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think a helpful question can be, do you have a sense of what you need? Like, after you've thanked them for sharing, of like, what do you want to do? What do you need? What's
Do we need to go
next?
get ice cream? Do we need to just be
Yeah.
silent?
Yeah.
Do we need to
I think
binge a
that
movie?
can,
Yeah,
because
exactly.
they may not be thinking
Right.
at all, and so just to like, not only will you listen to them, but you would like to care for them.
Right.
So how can I help in whatever way leads you to the next thing?
Any other thoughts? Chronic pain is not the same subject that we're talking about, but there's some overlap.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that we were told in our story of chronic pain is a counselor shared this with me. The counselor that has been my therapist and a friend for many years, he drew several concentric circles, and he said, Scott, I want you to put the sufferer, whichever person we're helping and loving, in the center of the circle. And then the next concentric circle are the people that are the absolute closest to them. And these are not like 20 people. These are 2 or 3 or 4, spouse, kids, whatever, right? And then after that is their community, the people they would call good friends or whatever. And he said the center circle only has out, right? So the arrows from the center circle go out. The arrows can be bad, good. I can vomit, I can cry, I can bless and laugh or whatever. The sufferer can do anything. That's the agency we're talking about. The other concentric circles, when they go towards the sufferer, when they move in, even the larger church towards the larger community, towards the family, towards the sufferer, we want to bless and encourage in. We don't want to say, oh God, that was so heavy for me to hear. And like you said, for the sufferer, feels like they have to care for the person that they shared it with. I am when I look towards the smaller circles, wherever they were, if it's 1 or 6, I want to bless in. If it's heavy for me, I want to go to a bigger circle. I want to share that with a bigger circle and just turn and go, somebody shared this with me anonymously. I'm not going to share details. It's really heavy for me. Can we talk about that? But I don't want to do it with a smaller circle. I want to do it with a bigger circle. Does that make sense?
That's so good.
And so that really helped because chronic pain, sexual violence, abuse, domestic violence, these kinds of things are heavy for anybody who carries them. But just like you as a counselor in a larger circle, you're not going to share how heavy it is for you with your client.
Right.
You're going to share it with your spouse or with somebody else in your community to help you carry it. And I thought that was good advice.
That's really good.
But I like this idea of attuning to their asking what they need, being a helpful regulatory presence with them, not feeling the need to answer. I would add to that, please don't feel the need to impersonate an expert you know, like don't feel the need to solve all the problems like a math equation, but just to be and to know that this abuse may have happened in a moment or it may have happened over a long time. But apart from God's miracle, and even probably even with some miraculous, it's not going to be undone in a moment, but it's going to be a journey.
Yeah. I think God
outward.
can heal like this,
Yes.
but more often he invites us into a
Correct.
process of healing.
Yeah.
And I think people want it to go quicker.
Yes.
I think with my
Absolutely.
clients, I find that a lot of
Yeah.
like, why can't I just like, whatever
Yeah.
it is that they're working on.
Yeah.
Final two questions. Tell us quickly about more information about the Reach Counseling Center. And then I want to hear from each of you, what resources, someone listening says, I want to know more about that. I want to read more about that. I want to listen, podcasts, etc., books. Where would you send them? We can't send them everywhere, of course, but your top 3 resources, whatever. But talk about the Reach Counseling Center quickly and tell people how to access that.
Yeah, I think we've talked about therapy a lot here, that it can be so helpful. It can be one of the safest places to even crack open that door of vulnerability a little bit. The Reach Counseling Center is, of course, a counseling center in Bellevue that Amy and I lead alongside or underneath the leadership of Reach Church. It includes discounted counseling at $50 per session right now. We have a team of essentially counselors and therapists there that do that work and are wonderful, and
When
we're
you guys
still kind of blown
when you
away.
guys open, and how do you get
We're
a
always
scholarship?
open.
We're like always open. We still can't believe it exists. It was something we were so excited about, and now it's really grown. Our team of interns has even grown. So now it is this group of therapists that are doing quite a few sessions every week, and Amy and I are trying to help them do really good work and be really safe with others.
Yeah, and I would say too, sometimes we have a wait list because we have high demand, but we will always give you referrals. So
Okay.
if we can't accommodate you right now and you really need to see a therapist, we have like a huge network of people we really trust to do good work. So yeah,
So you've done the curating and the vetting.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
How does one get an appointment?
If you go to reachcounseling.cc, I feel like you need to say it again. Reachcounseling.cc, or just look for Reach Counseling. You'll find it.
Good.
There's an interest form, very small, very simple, right on the front page that they can complete.
Excellent. Thank you. Resources that you would send people to who want to know more about this, who want to maybe know for themselves or on behalf of someone else. What resources or podcasts would you send them to?
Yeah, go for it.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I love Dan Ellender's work.
Yes.
He wrote a book, Healing the Wounded Heart. I think it's good for, especially when we're talking about educating ourselves, and the church is just a great place to start because it really just kind of unpacks everything. What's happening in sexual trauma, what's happening in the body, what's happening in the mind, what's happening in the spirit, how do we work with that, how do we heal from that? And it's just such a hopeful, he's like, gets really granular about the pain and the suffering, but also really hopeful on what does healing look like.
Amazing.
So I think they have a podcast. He has a podcast as well.
Yeah.
I think another one is Adam Young, his podcast. Is it The Place We Find Ourselves?
Yeah.
Just about what it is to address story, why it matters,
Wow.
like even the neurobiology
Yeah.
of healing, like what we learned in the last 3 years about neuroscience, about how the brain actually works and how
Yeah.
the mind works, is like huge. I think it's going
Yeah.
to revolutionize even how we do therapy, how we create healing spaces in churches. So I
Amazing.
think those 2 podcasts are great.
We mentioned it a little bit earlier, but Andi Kolber's book, Try Softer, I think is just a really great readable resource.
Tell me her name again.
Andi, Aundi. Kolber, it starts with a K.
Yeah.
It talks a lot about this embodiment of our story, and that it's very compassion oriented to having just more of a loving posture towards our stories and ourselves, and a lot of like, of course, that's how your body feels, like just a lot of validation. So I really, really love that book, and there's a workbook that you can do with that. It's maybe a little bit more on the like denser end of things, but I know The Body Keeps the Score is actually a really great resource just for understanding how our bodies hold our stories and our trauma. Sometimes I'll recommend to people to read like the first half, because the last half he goes into a lot of anecdotes, and so the information that he talks about in the first half of the book is just really, really, really helpful. And then I really like Kristen Neff's Self-Compassion. It is
NEFF?
NEFF, yes. It's not a faith-based resource necessarily, but she just talks a lot about the posture that we have towards ourselves. And I think that it can be a helpful resource, maybe not primary, but a helpful resource in understanding the role of self-compassion and even our language towards ourselves and what we call ourselves and that sort of thing has just been really helpful, I think, for me.
Josh, you've mentioned some books you're reading now. Any others?
Yeah, I really like Diane Legberg's Suffering in the Heart of God, because she addresses this issue and has an incredible lens for it. And yeah, the other ones that have been named are really great. I really like Andy Kolber's book.
I would recommend also a couple as a pastor, non-trained clinician, but I love Kurt Thompson, The Soul of Shame. He has a podcast as well. Kurt Thompson has a new book on suffering called The Deepest Place. That's, I think, exceptionally good. Aaron and I are both a fan of Dr. David Benner as well.
I was just thinking
And he has a trilogy. I think the best one is the second one called The Gift of Being Yourself. And I recommend that book highly. It makes me emotional just thinking about the title of the book, because I love it and it was life-changing for me. There's many, many, many resources out there. Reading and studying these things are only a part of the journey, but they can be helpful.
For what we're
yes.
talking about today, I think Kurt Thompson's The Soul of Desire
See, this is
really
one I have on my
important.
shelf. I haven't read it yet.
Yeah, because I think desire is what gets marred for somebody who
Oh,
has
very good.
been sexually violated.
Okay.
To
I've got that one in the Anatomy of the Soul that I've yet to read, but The Soul of Desire, Kurt Thompson, great. Kurt with a C. Excellent. Final question. We want to end on hope and grace and Jesus. And my friend Josh just blew my ever-loving mind off audio a second ago. Tell us what you shared. Get us an entree into that.
Well, I was blown away when I heard these connections too, but it's just interesting that Dinah and the woman at the well both come from the same hometown.
This is John 4.
This is in John 4 when Jesus meets the woman at the well in the same place, which is Sychar.
Shechem was renamed Sychar.
Yes.
Yeah.
Both women are from Shechem. Both of their lives forever changed by what happens to them in that place. Dinah's the daughter of the daughter whose name is mentioned at birth. The woman at the well still remains nameless. Although Dinah is silent in her story, we never hear her voice. Jesus has the longest recorded conversation with a woman in the New Testament at the well in John 4. Dinah's story ends in mass murder. The woman at the well story ends in mass revival. And prior to coming into Samaria, Jesus says he has to come here to the well. He has to come to Samaria, which is such an interesting statement because he didn't have to.
Well, and Jews didn't.
They didn't. For generations, they made a point of finding any way to not. And
when you're traveling north, you go from Jerusalem, you go the Via Maris, which is on the coast of the Mediterranean, or you go in the Jordan Rift Valley. You do not go from mountain range to mountain range through Samaria.
Yes.
Even that connection brings tears to my eyes. He says he has to go.
Has to go.
There's unfinished
work.
And it's unfinished. And I think about Shechem, just even that town became named after the man who did it.
Yeah.
Like what kind of generational trauma, how many generations of women have been abused, have been silenced in this town? And Jesus says, we have to go. I have to go. And then he does, and he comes to Shechem. And he disappears. It says that he leaves his disciples along the way. And where is he? And he's at the well. And he comes into Shechem, and there's a woman at the well. The well is still there. And there's a woman here alone, just like Dinah's story. And everything's turned upside down, which Jesus continually does. So Jesus goes into forbidden territory and talks to this woman, and we talked about how Jacob was passive, how Jacob does not act on behalf of Dinah. Well, Jesus just does the opposite here. And it's amazing that he's even sitting there when she comes up. He's sitting there. It's almost like he's waiting.
He is waiting. Yeah.
And he meets her with so much kindness. And he engages her story with so much kindness. And he treats her with dignity. And he's the image of what we are supposed to be in the face of stories of abuse. It says he had to find this place, had to have this conversation. And that place, Shechem, named Sychar in the New Testament, is the place that the gospel then moves through because of this conversation that he has with this woman. And moves, through Samaria, through to the ends of the world, beginning here.
Yeah.
And you can just feel the redemption that he's doing for this whole city through this woman. How she's even the one that he sends back to tell everyone.
She has a voice.
She has a voice.
A key voice. Yeah. The mountains between that city are Ebal and Gerizim. And on top of Gerizim, the Samaritans, who were the half-breed incestuous group of the poorest class left behind in the exile, who intermarried with pagan Gentiles that the Assyrians and Babylonians repopulated. And so that's why the Jews hated them. They were worse than dogs. They were, because they were half Jew and half pagan, half Gentile. And they had an alternate worship site on Mount Gerizim. And the reason why, here's my love of this story. A seminary professor did this, and it makes me weep every time. He said, there's Samaritans still today, and in Jesus' day, everybody wore the cream color, white colored linen. It was the cheapest, it was the coolest. This is what most people wore, except for royal people who could afford dyes and purple and all those kinds of things. Notice that she identified him as a Jew just by sight. And a lot of people ask why. Well, among several options, I think the most prevalent option is that his linen and his prayer tassels were likely fringed in blue. Jews fringed their things in blue. Samaritans fringed their things in red or red and black. Still today, Samaritan priests were red and black with their white. And so all of these people, we see them in our mind's eye, in our sanctified imagination, wearing these light-colored garments, which is very, very true to history. When she leaves, I love this story because it says she came with her water pot to get water in the middle of the day to avoid all the things, right? Well, when he gives her the living water by faith that bubbles up, it says, John records, she left her water pot behind. He records that detail. She came for water. She said, give me this water so I won't have to come, have this conversation. I will know the Messiah comes in the end. I am who speaks to you, am he. And then she leaves her water pot. She runs to tell the people in the city. And then while that's happening, the disciples come. And he said, we got him something to eat. And Jesus says, well, I have food to eat you know nothing about. And they're coming, what, did somebody bring him something to eat? All this kind of awkward thing. And then he begins to look. This is how my mind's eye see it. He begins to look at the fields, because this is in a valley. There are fields next, maybe it was a wheat field or a grain field. And the men of the city in white are walking back up because the woman has told them, come and see a man who's told me my whole life. Could this be the Messiah? They're walking through the field, and he says to his disciples, he goes, lift up your eyes and look to the fields because they are white for harvest. And I think it's at least possible, if not probable, that he's talking about the men and women in white that are walking through the fields coming to him. And he says he stayed there in Samaria, in Sychar for several days and shared with them. And there was a revival among the least people, the most hated people. I love that in many ways our conversation, we have said, is tried to redeem Dinah's story a bit. And I love that you, Josh, brought up the fact that how Jesus in John 4 did what Jacob should have done, what Jacob's sons should have done.
She asked him, "Are you better than our father Jacob?"
There you go.
And the reading is, he is.
He is what Jacob should have been. Yeah. Are you greater than our father Jacob? For all who are listening, we are collectively doing this and having this conversation for you and for each other, and want you to know that there is hope. There is hope for the restoration of faith and hope and love. There is hope for your story. There is redemption possible in Jesus, in the gospel, in his grace. And it's not necessarily going to be easy, but there are people who want to walk with you. This conversation is so important because for many listening, it's your story. And it's the story of maybe many people that we don't realize it's their story. And we want to just say the gospel of eternal life and abundant life and forgiveness and restoration in Jesus isn't cheap, but it's free. It's simple. It's by faith in Jesus. And you can find abundant life in a God who cares. Again, there is this invisible, intangible redemption that happens to a person when they place their faith in Jesus. But that doesn't necessarily mean it goes and miraculously unravels all of the stories before. As we said, God can heal miraculously in a moment, and he often does, still does. But oftentimes he wants us to walk with people, walk with other believers, brothers and sisters, and trust them, and walk with him and his Spirit to undo those stories and redeem those stories bit by bit. I don't know why he does that, but he does it. And any last words of hope you want to share with our listeners before we conclude?
It makes me think everything that we've been talking about. I've been thinking about the passage that Paul talks about when he says, "May you be whole and holy." And I'm just going to read the Message version.
Yeah, I love it.
But
That's
it's,
okay.
"May God himself, the God who makes everything holy and whole, make you holy and whole, put you together, spirit, soul, and body." So that idea of like bringing things back together in the way that it was
What's
meant
the
to be.
address? Ephesians?
No, 1 Thessalonians
I
5:23
love it.
through
Oh,
24.
amazing.
Yeah.
Read it one more time.
Yeah. May God himself, the God who makes everything holy and whole, make you holy and whole, put you together, spirit, soul, and body.
Thank you. Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Josh. Thank you for being a
Thank
part
you.
of this
Thanks for
conversation. And
having
thank
me.
you guys for listening. We bless you in the name of Jesus. Thanks, sir.
Amen.
Amen.